From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi everybody, I am Abby Nolan and I review children's books for the Washington Post, which has been a charter sponsor and enthusiastic supporter of the festival for all of its 15 years. I'm very honored to be introducing Lynne Rae Perkins, who is a great storyteller as well as a wonderful artist for all age groups. Her novels include All Alone in the Universe and Criss Cross, which won the Newbery Award. She has illustrated such books as Seed by Seed, which is about Johnny Appleseed, one of my favorites, beautiful book. She has written and illustrated such picture books as Snow Music and Pictures from Our Vacation. Lynne Rae Perkins' latest book, Nuts to You, may well have been inspired by the landscape of northern Michigan, where she lives now with her family. The story is an adventure-filled tribute to trees and the squirrels who need and appreciate them. Booklist put it on their top 10 books list on environmental subjects. Please help me welcome the multi-talented Lynne Rae Perkins.
Thank you for coming. Hi. I'm going to try to be ambidextrous here. I'm going to show you pictures and also hold the microphone, so I'll try to do that smoothly. I'm going to talk about the book Nuts to You. I'm going to talk about where it came from and how it became a book, and that will take me about 20 minutes, and then I will be answering any questions that you have. So I will begin by saying, this is a scientific diagram of where books come from. I think that in my books, they're sort of equally made up of things I do on purpose, things that happen by accident, and things that seem to come out of nowhere. In this case, I was sitting at my desk one day. I was actually working on the illustrations for Seed by Seed, the book about Johnny Appleseed, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the phrase, "The squirrel who cried wolf," popped into my head. And I don't know where it came from, but it made me laugh. And I wrote it down on a little piece of paper and left it on my desk and kept working on the thing I was working on. And a couple weeks later, I would still see this little piece of paper and it would still make me laugh, "The squirrel who cried wolf." How many of you know the story of the boy who cried wolf? Okay, so you know that story. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the way I work. I'm very lucky in that every morning my husband brings me a thermos of coffee up to my bedroom, and I crawl from bed over to this nice gold velvet chair by the window, and I sit there with my coffee and my notebook and I think. And morning is one of my best times for thinking, so I get some of my best ideas then. So I started thinking about this squirrel story. And one of the things I thought about, I liked the idea of the phrase, the squirrel who cried wolf. So I started thinking about other titles that could have squirrels in, like Where the Squirrels Are, or The Squirrel Who Fell to Earth. And I had a whole string of these titles, and that is sort of where I got started. And then I also started thinking about different things that could happen to squirrels. Like they could run into tree trimmers, they could get eaten by wolves, they could get eaten by hawks, they could get eaten by an awful lot of different things. And so I was writing those things down too and thinking about them. And then I was also thinking about the different kinds of squirrel stories there could be. Like it could be a squirrel romance, or it could be a squirrel adventure story, or like a squirrel soap opera. Or maybe the squirrel could get amnesia and forget who he was and come back years later. So I was just thinking a lot of silly thoughts, and in a lot of ways it was just a little bit of a lark or a fun thing to think about. And I sort of decided, I was thinking about the hawk idea. I was thinking, wouldn't it be kind of funny if the squirrel was crying wolf, and then what really happened was a hawk? And so I did a little bit of research, and I found out that most of the time when a hawk grabs a squirrel, that hawk is done for right away. That squirrel isn't going to go anywhere. And so I thought, well, that's not going to work out very well for my story, especially if this is the first chapter of the book. So I mentioned it to my husband, and he told me that he had just very recently seen a hawk drop a squirrel, and the squirrel ran away. So I knew that it could happen. I knew the squirrel could survive. So that became my very first part of the story. Oh, oops, there's the hawk. There was the hawk grabbing the squirrel, and the squirrel looking surprised. When I first started thinking about this story, I thought that I would like to have on the left side of the page the story told like a comic book in graphic novel kind of format. And on the right side of the page, I would have the story told in words. I thought that would be a fun way for kids to read the book. As I went on, it didn't stay quite so organized as all that. It became more like story with lots of pictures. But that is where I started, and it got me started drawing squirrels. And I didn't want my squirrels to have outfits on. I wanted them to look more like regular squirrels. So I started thinking about how could I, in my drawings, how could I make one squirrel look different from another squirrel? It was pretty tricky. And so like this, for example, the one squirrel had a beauty mark on her cheek as her identifying mark. Pretty subtle. So I had little notes about the different squirrels. And then I was running out of options on how to make the squirrels look different. And I decided one squirrel could have an outfit. One squirrel could have a beret made of an acorn top. And so I tore this picture out of a wildlife guide, and I painted a little acorn hat on it. And I thought, wow, that squirrel looks so familiar. Who does he remind me of? And then I realized, does anybody have any guesses who he reminded me of? He reminded me of Che Guevara. So while I was working on this, whoops, this thing is going too fast. While I was working on it, at first his name was Che, and then I thought, like, this is not a political book. I don't want the squirrel to be named Che. So I changed his name to Chai. But what it got me thinking about was, wouldn't it be fun if the squirrels had names that sounded like sounds squirrels would make? So I spent some time thinking about what are some different names that squirrels could have that sound like things squirrels might say. So there's Chai, because, you know, they make those ch-ch-ch-ch sounds. And then there's the squirrel whose name is spelled T-S-T-S, which humans pronounce as sutsa, but to a squirrel it sounds more like. So the Chai-Che thing led me into the squirrel names. And by this point, I had decided that this would be a rodent adventure novel. Now, I don't know why there are so many stories that have rodents. You know what I mean when I talk about rodents, right? Like mice, rats, squirrels, those kind of little animals. I don't know why there are so many really good stories about rodents, but there are. These are some of my favorites. There's The Wind in the Willows, and A Mouse and His Child, and Terry Pratchett's Amazing Morris, and I have William Steig's Abel's Island in there. I think it's because we have rodents all around us, and they're part of our world. And we look at them, and they look back at us. And when that happens with any creature, you start to connect with that creature and think, well, what is he feeling or thinking? So I think that might be why there are so many of them. Anyway, I decided that that's what this one would be. So since I had decided it was going to be about squirrels, I had to do a little bit of research. And that meant I had to do some of my research in books. I had to learn things about, like, what do squirrels eat and what are their nests like. And then sometimes when you do research, you just have to find out in person and talk to the actual person who knows all the answers. And a lot of questions, I would come up with a little part of the story, and I would need to do more research. I would have to answer questions like, can a squirrel climb metal? Yes, a squirrel can climb metal. I can't quite see all my questions there, but what do they eat, and why don't they get electrocuted when they run on those wires? And the answer to that is they do if they have like 1 foot on the grounded part, and then they touch a part that's not grounded, and they make a complete circuit, and goodbye. Goodbye, squirrel. But I learned a lot of things. When you do research, you always learn a lot of things that you don't use. I learned that there have been what they call great squirrel migrations, where huge numbers of squirrels, for reasons nobody really understands, travel from one part of the country to another. And it's not because there's no food, because usually there's a lot of food when they do it. But when they do that, they can even swim across lakes. And they have had instances recorded, and recent, like in the 1800s, but also in the 1960s, where squirrels, they can swim. They can swim, they use the doggy paddle stroke, and they swam across a reservoir, and when they encountered a man in a boat, they just climbed onto his boat and over and back in the water, and they kept swimming. So I learned a lot of interesting things. But when you're writing a story about a squirrel that's talking and philosophizing, it's not really a story about, the true facts of squirrel life in a way. It's more like a story about us. So the story happens somewhere in between where the squirrels live and squirrels as stand-ins for us. So it was fun to imagine how things might seem to a squirrel, though. I'm going to read you a couple examples. There's a part where one of the squirrels is talking about what it's like to see a hunter dressed in camouflage. So imagine that for a minute, and it says, "Fortunately, they were easy to spot once you learned how. The first time Chai saw one, he didn't know what was going on. The hillside seemed all shifty and shimmery. There were floating human heads with no bodies. It made him feel dizzy, and he thought he might be coming down with something. He had to grab onto the tree trunk, but it was an optical illusion. Once you saw the pattern they had wrapped themselves in, you couldn't unsee it. It was kind of cheesy, really." And then there's another part where one of the squirrels encounters peanut butter for the first time. So imagine you're a squirrel and you're getting your first taste of peanut butter. Her heart was racing, and she took the food in her paws while she calmed herself. She took deep, slow breaths in and out. She tried to empty her mind. This is because she just ran away from some people. While her mind was emptying, her paws lifted the food to her mouth, and she bit into it. Oh my, wow, it was delicious. What was this brown, creamy stuff? She had never tasted anything quite like it. She licked at her paws where some of the stuff had stuck. So those are two little examples of trying to imagine squirrel life. I think I forgot to show you the picture. Whoop. There's Tootsa encountering peanut butter. It was a religious experience for her. So anyway, at this point in the story, I was getting a lot of ideas, but I didn't have a really clear idea how any of it would fit together. The hard part in writing a book, I think, is trusting that it will come together, and you just keep going and collecting your ideas. The nice part about that is that you don't have to figure it out all at once. You can figure it out a little bit at a time. For example, this is one of the things that in the last picture, you can see it in the middle there. It's one of the little ideas that I had. I wanted to have a squirrel escaping from a bobcat. That's my first drawing of that. And it became this drawing. So, on any given day, you don't have to figure out the whole story. You just say, what would it be like for the squirrel to escape from a bobcat? And draw a picture of that, maybe. And it's not that that's super easy to do. That's kind of hard to do, too. But you can do it, and it's fun to do. And while you're doing all these things, while you're collecting all these ideas, your brain is figuring things out without you. This is a picture of a famous detective who would gather all his facts And then he would go have dinner or something and he'd say, I'm going to let the little gray cells work. And he's talking about his brain cells. He's Poirot, an Agatha Christie detective. And that's what happens when you're working on the drawings or you're collecting things. Your brain is working away, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. So I do a lot of drawings, and in my studio I have 3 big bulletin boards. And as I'm working on the drawings, I put them all up in order, and I start to feel like I'm living in the world where all this is happening. And the characters start to take shape. You start to know how this squirrel is going to act or what that squirrel is going to say. And it's almost like you have a little theater company, and you can say to yourself, okay, you two, I'm putting you in this situation. What are you going to do? And then you sit there and wait, and because you know who they are now, they tell you what they're going to do. And now, before I have you ask questions, I'm going to read you the first chapter of Nuts to You. Almost there. Okay. The first chapter, of course, is called The Squirrel Who Cried Wolf. It's true that there was a wolf, or wolves. There may have been more than one. Maybe they were actually coyotes. Who knows? They all look pretty much the same to a squirrel. Huge, shaggy, terrible yellow eyes, red slobbery mouth with big sharp pointy teeth. And it's true that if you're a squirrel on the ground and a wolf or a coyote strolls into the neighborhood, running up a tree is your best plan. No one's going to argue with that. The problem was the squirrel called Jip. He kept yelling wolf just to see everyone run. He had been doing it all day. He thought it was funny. And a little bit, it made him feel important. Because most of the time, no one listened or paid any attention to him. But when he shouted, wolf, up the trees they all went, except for Jed. Jed looked at him, annoyed. Wolf, he shouted again. But Jed stayed put. He was busy. He had nuts to bury. Winter was coming. The first frost was long gone, and the air felt cooler with each passing day. Leaves were falling into crispy yellow piles on the ground. Any day now there would be snow. Just a little at first, then mountains of it. Wolf, 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 Jed said irritably. Is that the only word he knows? Jed did look around to see if there was a wolf, because he was irritated, but you just never know. Sure enough, no wolf in sight. He shook his head and went back to his work, muttering and nattering. Wolf, shrieked Jip. Wolf, 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 Jed muttered. There is no wolf. And then the foolish Jip saw something. Not a wolf, but something very real, something dangerous. In his fright, he blurted out the first word that popped into his head, the word he'd been saying all day. Wolf? Muttering and digging, Jed did not notice until the very last instant how the air above him had gone suddenly still and silent. Oh, he said in surprise. As a set of talons tightened around him and lifted him up, up, up past every whirl of branches, up above the treetops into the vast reaches of sky. Cold air rushed over his face, forced his eyes to squeeze shut. Every muscle in his body tensed up. He may have peed a little bit. Who wouldn't? All four of his paws curled and clenched. His mind raced. A mighty wave of fear rolled in and filled him up. And somehow, even through the roaring of the fear and the rushing of the air, he could hear a small voice inside him saying, "This is it then." Jip watched the fearsome bird swoop down, snatch his cousin Jed, and swoop back up. Hawk, he said, correcting himself. I should have cried hawk. So he did it now. Hawk, he cried. Hawk, hawk. And thus ends chapter 1. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, wow, 5 minutes left. Okay, sorry. I thought it was going short.
How did you choose all of the characters and how they would act and other stuff?
How did I choose the characters?
And how they would act.
And how they would act. Oh, that's a good question. Sometimes when people ask me questions, I have to think back because it's been a long time since I did that part. Well, I knew right away that the squirrel who cried wolf was going to be kind of a silly wolf, and he stayed silly all the way through the book. And I knew that the wolf, Jed, who ignored him, was going to be like a smart squirrel, and he stayed smart all the way through the story. And then Sutta, who's the one who decides to go and find him, I knew she was going to be a loyal friend, because anybody who would travel that far to find a friend is, that kind of a person. So the funny thing is, when you first start writing the story, maybe you only know one thing about a character, but as you go on, you learn things about them and find out new things about them. So it's pretty interesting the way it works.
How has writing changed you? Not only you, but the people around you.
Wow, that's a really good question. How has writing changed me and the people around me? I think it makes me pay... Where did the person go who asked that question? Okay. I think it makes me pay more attention to things. I think that one of my very favorite things about writing, or one of my very favorite things, period, is getting ideas. And I think, a lot of people think you don't start writing till you get an idea, but I find that you get ideas from writing. So the more you write, the more ideas you get. And I think that makes your life a lot more interesting and more fun. So it's changed things that way for me, and hopefully for those around me too.
Do you illustrate your own books, or how do you get another person to write and draw them for you?
I have drawn all my own books so far. I just wrote a story that if anybody wants to publish it, I'm hoping somebody else will draw the pictures for it. And when that happens, and the reason is because it has these kind of odd creatures in it that isn't my specialty in drawing. So when that happens, the publishing company, they know so many people who are really great artists that they think about all the people they know who are good artists, and they think, who would be just right for this book? So if it's a book about dragons, they think about all the people they know who draw dragons, and then they ask somebody, and if that person says yes, that's how it works.
What is your next chapter?
The next chapter. Well, I'm going to tell you that Jed falls from the hawk's talons and lands in a pile of leaves. But he lands in a place where different squirrels than him live. And they don't have another language, but they have another sort of accent, and he has to figure that out, and they eat different foods. So that's what happens in the very next part.
How did you get started with the pictures?
With the pictures? How did I get started with the pictures? So for me, I like to do different things all the time, which means I am always doing things that I don't really know how to do. And so the first ones I do are never quite right. So sometimes the hardest part about starting a new bunch of drawings is knowing that I'm going to do it wrong first, because I want to do it right. I want it to turn out really well. And sometimes I look at the first tries and think, but if I try again, that's usually the key. I have to keep trying, And so one time this winter, I pretended, do you know what a mentor is? It's like somebody who kind of coaches you. I guess coach would be a good word, but I was using the word mentor. So I was having imaginary mentors. And one of my imaginary mentors this winter was Paul Zielinski, who's a really good drawer. And I tried to imagine if he were my teacher, what he would say. And he kept saying, why don't you just give it another try? And, it was really helpful. I told him that, and he said, I should take my own advice.
How do you make the squirrel differences?
I'm sorry?
How did you make the squirrels all different?
Oh, how did I make them all different? Okay. Well, Tsuta had a really, she was the main girl. There's two main girl squirrels, actually. So she has she was sort of more beautiful. And then I got another girl squirrel, and she was beautiful too, but she was shaggier, so you could tell her from the smooth girl squirrel. And then, Chai had the acorn hat, and so those were the four main ones. And Jed was just sort of like a straight-on squirrel. He was there first, so he didn't have to be too different.
I found your books very exciting and fun to read. Was it hard to think up the big scenes?
Was it hard to think up the big scenes? It's kind of funny. It's like I didn't really have a super big plan at first. I would just think, well, what would happen next? So I just sort of put one foot in front of the other. And I think there were hard parts, but I think a lucky thing about me is that as soon as I'm done with something hard, I forget that it was hard.
How many books did you write? This is your first time?
How many books did I do? I have about, I think, 6 or 7 picture books and 4 longer books like this one. So 10. Well, thank you so much. I think we're all done. And thank you for coming, and have a good time at the rest of the festival.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.